Today from the global lane, Egypt's proposal for a Gaza hostage release and ceasefire. Is an agreement ahead?
I think at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the Trump administration here, whether they're going to not force a solution on Israel, not force a compromise on Israel, really put more of an emphasis on getting the hostages out.
Trump meets with Netanyahu. U.S. negotiators prepare for talks with Iran.
The key in terms of the Iranian talks, and especially for Israel watchers, is to see, are the Iranians going to try to drag out the process again like they did with the Biden administration?
Trump announces a 90-day pause on tariffs, and the trade war with China escalates.
It's a high-stakes game of chicken, and again, it's all about the international economy. Who's going to quote-unquote win?
5 years after the start of COVID, medical freedom comes to Idaho.
It is truly revolutionary. No one in the state of Idaho can be coerced into taking any kind of a medical intervention against their will or their conscience.
And Marco Rubio's act of kindness at NATO headquarters. And it's all right here on the global lane. A new Gaza hostage ceasefire deal is in the works in Cairo, and direct talks between the United States and Iran are set to begin. Here with more is Jewish News Syndicate correspondent Mike Wagenheim. Mike, thanks for being with us. So, President Trump met with Prime Minister Netanyahu recently, and he announced direct talks with Iran. So both Netanyahu and Trump suggested they'd like to see a nuclear deal with Iran, similar to one reached in 2003 with Libya. So tell us more. What are the prospects of reaching an agreement?
Well, a couple of points of context here, Gary, and thanks for having me on today. Number one, the Iranians have already thrown cold water on the idea that talks coming up on Saturday in Oman are going to be direct talks. They say it's going to be indirect, at least to begin with, and if they get a good sense that things are progressing, that maybe a deal can be struck, then they'd be willing to move on to direct talks. So a little bit of gamesmanship right there at the outset. There's definitely a difference of opinion here between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. They're both in agreement that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons, but certainly I would say there's a disagreement, or at least a sort of a difference in how to approach the matter. Netanyahu said a diplomatic solution along the lines of what we saw with Libya many years ago could potentially work, but President Trump fashions himself as the ultimate deal maker here, and he's looking for a deal with Iran, and especially with some of the folks that he selected for his administration who are more wary about wars in the Middle East, about military action in the Middle East. They're looking more toward a diplomatic solution and maybe willing to pay a little bit higher cost for it here. I think the key in terms of the Iranian talks, and especially for Israel watchers, is to see, are the Iranians going to try to drag out the process again like they did with the Biden administration, constantly moving the goalposts, setting new standards, biding for time, essentially? I think this will be a key indicator for the Trump administration to watch for here. Are the Iranians going to stick to what's agreed upon, the preliminary parameters that may even be set up Saturday in Oman, or will they continue again to just kind of try to change the terms and the rules of the game as they go along? I think that will be more important than anything as to whether a deal can actually be struck or not.
Well, years ago, I covered Ronald Reagan, and he always said, trust but verify. So it seems like that's the issue. Iranian nuclear sites are likely to come under attack if an agreement isn't reached. So how united do you think Trump and Netanyahu are on that, a military response, and how would Arab countries react?
Well, the trust but verify thing with the Iranians has always been difficult because they don't allow verification in the way that the international community would like or has demanded, or that Iran has agreed to in the past. So verification has always been a problem, including this year when Iran was censured by the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors because of their obstruction to verification processes that are on the books here. In terms of how the international community, the Arab community, is going to react, they've largely deferred thus far to President Trump on a lot of matters. There's been very little pushback thus far, except with the Gaza situation, and even then it was kind of tepid and around the edges. So I don't expect a particularly harsh reaction here to whatever Trump determines, especially given that he is willing to open up the door once again to diplomacy. It's really tough for Iran's neighbors, especially those that have a bone to pick with the mullahs to begin with, to say, well, you've opened up the door to talks here. You're willing to talk in good faith If Iran doesn't comply, if they're continuing to obstruct here, I don't really know what kind of great pushback Trump's going to see here from Iran's neighbors, especially those that are so friendly with the Trump administration to begin with.
Well, you had mentioned Gaza. Egypt has a new ceasefire hostage exchange proposal for Gaza. President el-Sisi's plan includes the release of 8 or 9 hostages. One would include an American, and then a 40 to 70-day ceasefire with no Israeli airstrikes. So do you think Israel and Hamas will agree to that? Tell us more about that one.
Egypt is kind of trying to thread the needle here, compromising, essentially offering up a compromise between the terms laid down by Hamas, which was fewer released hostages and a longer ceasefire, and what's been offered on the other side, well, not the other side, but by Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy for Donald Trump for the Middle East, offering more hostages coming out. So this is kind of in between, and Egypt trying to play a role here. At the end of the day, Israel and Hamas, very, very difficult to agree upon anything. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the Trump administration here, whether they're going to not force a solution on Israel, not force a compromise on Israel, really put more of an emphasis on getting the hostages out rather than threatening Hamas with a consequence if they don't do so. So that may be a little bit of guidance there as to how they may approach some compromise that may or may not have been offered.
Finally, the Jerusalem Post reported a high-ranking envoy from Sudan flew to Israel, where he met recently with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he discussed the Sudanese president's desire to normalize relations with Israel. So that would be huge, would it not? How true do you think that report is, and what have you heard? What do you think?
So I think some of us forget it's the forgotten Abraham Accord. The Israeli government in Sudan actually signed a normalization agreement back in October of 2020. It got lost in the mix with everything going on with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco. But because of the situation in Sudan and because of the end of the first Trump administration, that deal kind of fell apart. It was on paper, but never really put into practice like the other Abraham Accords agreements were. And then, of course, we saw what happened in future years in Sudan and a horrible situation that continues there even to the present day here. It's always a positive sign that the Israeli government is conducting talks with neighbors, especially those that they still don't have some sort of formal normalized relationship with here. In terms of actually signing an agreement, again, with the situation in Sudan and so much uncertainty right now, I'm not sure if the time is right for that sort of broad agreement, because you need it to carry on to the next government. You needed to carry on in an economically viable way. But the very fact that they're talking, certainly better than no talks at all.
Okay, Mike Wagenheim, JNS correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us, Mike. We appreciate it. What goes up must come down. That's Newton's law of gravity, and it may eventually apply to many of President Trump's tariffs. We'll hear with more on this, and also to share his thoughts on MAHA proposed food stamp reforms is Alexander Salter, economics professor at Texas Tech University. Professor Salter is also a researcher at the Free Market Institute, a fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, and a Young Voices contributor. Good to talk with you again, Alexander. I want to get into your thoughts on the MAHA food stamp reform, but first, Trump's tariffs are still dominating the news and the markets, especially Wall Street. So short-term pain, long-term gain here. What are your thoughts?
I'm having a hard time seeing what the long-term gain could be. Keep in mind that we saw $10 trillion in global asset wealth wiped out in 72 hours as markets reacted catastrophically to these new and unnecessary taxes on trade. Now, I understand the administration's position. They want to shore up the defense industrial base. They say they want to renegotiate some trade treaties. But let's keep our eye on the ball here. A tariff is a tax. Taxes discourage the production and distribution of wealth. You cannot make your country richer by not trading with people. And yet this administration seems to think that throwing up trade barriers is somehow going to bring back manufacturing jobs as if it's 1950. It's not going to happen. All that's going to happen is that they're going to throw a wrench into the gears of the international economy, destroying trillions of dollars of wealth besides. So I have to hope that this is a negotiation ploy, even though the administration insists that it's not. But let's also keep in mind that this sort of method of negotiating tariffs, actually threatening and levying tariffs only to walk them back later, has a pretty mixed track record.
And while many countries want to work a deal to negotiate lower rates, China boosted their tariffs against the U.S. This seems to be a poker game, only here lives, jobs, billions of dollars are at stake. What do you think is going to happen here? After all, China is our biggest trade partner.
It's a high stakes game of chicken. And this, again, it's all about the international economy. Who's going to quote unquote win? But of course, that's the wrong way of looking at it, right? Economics is not a zero sum game. Trade is not I win, you lose, or you win, I lose. Trade creates winners on both sides of the transaction. Now, I understand the concerns about trading with China, given the authoritarian nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm actually very sympathetic to the idea that our trade policy should explicitly incorporate national defense considerations. So if that's the case and you want to promote a strategic decoupling from the Chinese economy for the purposes of promoting U.S. resilience, I'm open to that. But in which case, the tariffs on other countries, especially our allies, should be zero.
Now, on making America healthy again, you recently wrote an article about the MAHA movement and their proposal to limit Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits to healthy foods. MAHA advocates have proposed eliminating high-carb and sugary snack foods, Coke, soda pop, from the list of items that can be purchased by people that receive food assistance through SNAP benefits. So you contend that instead of reducing obesity rates, that move may unintentionally increase junk food consumption. Why is that?
It's possible that junk food consumption will go up depending on how the policy is structured. Here's the key economic insight, and here's the cool explanation for the counterintuitive claim that food stamp reform might actually contribute to worse health outcomes. Every time I give you a government voucher for something, food, shelter, clothing, whatever, it frees up $1 worth of your other income to buy anything else with. So when you subsidize food, it might be the case that the people who take those food stamps go to more baseball games. People can spend the additional income in counterintuitive and often unexpected ways. We give people food stamps. We expect that they're going to spend more on food, but we forget that they probably have some additional sources of income which have now been released from food that can be used to purchase anything else. So this insight also applies to food stamps. Remember, they're going to need congressional approval to fundamentally restructure the program. What if, to tout their working class populist bona fides, they increase the total amount of benefits, but also take away food stamp spending on junk food? So it seems obvious that if you take away spending on junk food, that should result in less junk food spending, but you've increased the total amount of the food stamp. So other income can then be used to purchase those Snickers and sodas and Pringles. And the net result is that people don't scale back their consumption at all. You've just given them the means to afford other things.
And Alexander, quickly on the issue of taxes, it's that time of year again, April 15th, federal income taxes are due. Are Americans paying more this year compared to last year? And how likely do you think Congress would be to extend the Trump tax cuts?
How much Americans are paying is going to depend on a variety of factors, and ultimately depends on how well the economy is doing this year compared to last year. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an increase in tax receipts compared to last year, but at the same time, there have been a lot of exemptions, extensions. So depending on how many households and businesses elect to take advantage of that, that's ultimately going to affect the bottom line in terms of what the Treasury takes in. I think that sometimes we obsess too much over the particularities of the tax code in the short run. What we really need is fundamental tax reform in this country. We should broaden the base, lower the rate, close the remaining loopholes. You should be able to fill out your income taxes on a postcard. It should not be anywhere near as complicated as it is. It takes billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of hours for the American public every year just to do their taxes. Think of how much richer we could be if we could free up that wealth, that time, that effort, that energy, and produce other goods and services with it. This is really just a sink, and I think that the U.S. tax code is a mess, partly because it's so complicated, because legislators seem to want to use the tax code not to raise revenue, but to make social policy. And I think that that's a fundamentally misguided approach. You want to make sure the tool matches the needs of the trade. Taxes are about raising revenue. Let's not try and do social engineering just to make the tax code more complicated.
Okay, Professor Alexander Salter, Texas Tech University and Young Voices contributor. Thank you for sharing your insights. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Gary.
Idaho has become the first U.S. state to enact a law protecting personal medical freedom. This means no longer will anyone in Idaho be denied access to employment, education, or businesses based on their health choices. Well, here to explain more is Leslie Manookian. She's president and founder of Health Freedom Defense Fund and one of the authors of the new law. Leslie, first, why was there a need for this legislation? What happened in Idaho that inspired you and others to push for a new law?
Well, I have been involved with the vaccine safety awareness movement for a very long time. But what happened, of course, in the last 5 years is the COVID responses. So the policies implemented that came down from the governor and the health departments that forced Idahoans to, stand on circles and operate behind plexiglass, and children who had to be plexiglassed and masked and be vaccinated. And a dear family friend of mine was actually paralyzed by a COVID shot that he didn't want because his employer coerced him into getting it. And he will sit in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And so this was the motivation for me to actually write this bill and then push for it.
Well, what specifically then does this law do?
Yeah, it ensures that almost no one in the state of Idaho can be excluded from normal life or coerced into taking any kind of a medical intervention against their will or their conscience. I say almost because there is a carve out for hospitals that take CMS funding, just because we had to do that there's a Supreme Court case from a couple of years ago that says that that they can actually force COVID shots. Now, what's happened is our bill says that they can only require standards that were deemed appropriate before 2020. So they can't add anything that happened in 2020 or anything new. It can only be anything that's a vocational or historical, traditional vocational hazard or something like that.
Well, then I've got to ask, the country's currently experiencing a measles outbreak. So does this mean an unvaccinated child then could attend public schools that have traditionally required measles vaccines?
Well, first of all, the state of Idaho for decades has not required measles vaccines. They mandate them, but they have the broadest vaccine exemption in the nation. So vaccines are effectively voluntary in the state of Idaho. And you may not realize this, but more children have died from the measles vaccine in the last 20 years than from measles. And it's very, it's highly controversial. Now, roughly 12% of Idaho school children do not get that shot. And so this isn't changing any of that. And what it does do is say that children who are unvaccinated don't have to be excluded from school, which is a huge step forward for those of us who believe that our immune systems given to us by God are perfect. And as long as they're well nourished, it's extremely rare for a child to have an issue with measles. They recover quite easily from it as long as they're well nourished and have adequate vitamin A. And so this is really about putting the power back into the hands of the individual, where I think it belongs, because each and every one of us is a child of God, and it's up to us to decide what we're going to do with our bodies.
The governor vetoed an earlier version of this legislation, forcing it to be revised. So where does the accepted version fall short?
Yeah, let me just say that before the measles vaccine was ever introduced, there were a few hundred deaths from measles every year in a country of 150 or 60 million. It had died out, essentially, and the death rate from public health measures like getting clean drinking water, getting the sewage out of the streets and things like this. That was before the vaccine was ever introduced. So this idea that the vaccine saved us is just not accurate. With respect to the bill, the best bill, the bill that was signed by the governor was actually the best bill. The first bill he vetoed, claiming that he was concerned that sick children could not be sent home from school. The governor's office met with the original bill sponsor and convinced him somehow to exclude daycares from it. And I said I would not have anything to do with a bill that excluded daycares, that literally forced children or forced parents to vaccinate their children against their conscience in order to put them in daycare, into private daycares. And almost all daycares, I think all daycares in Idaho are private. And so the House introduced a competing bill, and it went back and forth until the very, very final day of the session. And then what happened was the governor signed the best bill that we could have hoped for, which said that healthy people cannot be excluded on the basis of their vaccination status from anywhere. And it also says that this code cannot be contradicted by any other code. So we have a fantastic bill that protects our most fundamental and basic God-given human rights, and also ensures that if someone is sick, that they can then be sent home. a business can send them home or something like this. It is truly revolutionary. I don't think it should be. I think it's common sense that each and every one of us should be responsible for our lives, and that only each and every one of us knows what's best for each of us, that no one else has to live with the consequences of our choices, and therefore no one else should be dictating them. But, you know, it's kind of amazing that this is the first state to do it.
Okay, it's precedent setting. We'll see if other states follow the lead. Leslie Manookian, president of Health Freedom Defense Fund, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been in office for less than 3 months, yet he's already making a significant impact. At home, he's revoking the visas of pro-Hamas activists, while abroad, he's leading diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. Additionally, Rubio has adopted a tough stance against Nicolas Maduro for failing to accept regular flights of deported members of the Tren de Aragua gang from Venezuela. Rubio has made history as the highest-ranking Hispanic official in the U.S. government. And as Secretary of State, he's fourth in line for the presidency. However, what truly caught our attention was the graciousness and respect that he showed to some young journalists recently, even as he was running late for a NATO foreign ministers meeting.
Good morning, Mr. Rubio. Can I ask you a question?
Sure. Can you wait till I walk out because I'm late for a meeting? What's your question? I got to do it. Come on. But not with these guys, only with you.
Are you going to make friends today?
Yes. We always make friends. We have friends here. We always try to make friends. These are longtime friends and people we've worked with for a very long time, and that'll continue to happen. We've got some differences of opinion, but friends have differences of opinion, but we'll work through them because the important things matter to us.
And what is your message for young people in NATO countries?
That NATO is stronger than it's ever been. It's going to continue to get stronger because all the countries in NATO are going to spend more money and have more capabilities. So we're going to be a stronger partnership because our partners are going to be stronger.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Can
you.
we have a high five?
Hold on. All
Thank
right,
you.
that's awesome.
Bye. Bye.
What do you guys, do they pay you to do this? Huh? Make sure they pay you. You guys are better than these guys.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so much.
you.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Secretary Rubio. You could have kept walking. We appreciate that simple act of kindness with the kids, giving you and us a brief respite from the gloom of global turmoil. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Until next time, be blessed.